project. Thank you for tuning in to our 35th anniversary celebration of the founding of our organization. We have an exciting program for you tonight, and I'd like to go over the agenda. There are quite a few people on Zoom who are already familiar with Sister City, but there are also a number of people who may not know much about our organization. In order to familiarize you with our history in Nicaragua, we'll play a short video that tells about our founding in 1985 and the many projects we've done in Quezalguaque since then. After that, you'll hear about the raffle prizes for 10 lucky winners who contribute $100 or more by midnight. And finally, we'll hear from our guest speaker, Dr. Aviva Chomsky, author, activist, and professor, who has written numerous articles and books and given countless lectures at conferences and other events in the US and abroad. The sister city relationship between Brookline and Quezalguaque is one of collaboration. Members travel to Nicaragua to find out the needs of the town by discussing them with the mayor and other officials. Then we raise funds, as we're doing tonight, to be able to start these projects. We continue to communicate with the leaders to find out how they're doing and then travel to Quezalguaque to see them completed. We hope you get a better idea of these needs and feel moved to contribute after you watch this video. In the chat box, you can see the Sister City website where you can donate. And if it's not there now, it will be there soon. And now I will share the screen and start the video. In 1985, Brookline resident and educator Maxine Shaw was living and teaching in a one-room schoolhouse in rural Quezalguaque, Nicaragua. Friends from Brookline visited and saw the need for support, so they began sending school supplies. They also undertook other projects, such as purchasing a cow to provide milk for her young students. In 1987, with the help of several groups, an official sister city relationship was established between the town of Brookline and Quezalguaque. 35 years later, we're still in that relationship, and this video highlights a few of our many projects.
Hi, I'm Maxine Shaw, and I'm sitting in front of a painting of the Quezalguaque Library, which was done by Felipe Loza, who was mayor of Quezalguaque at the time that the library was opened in 2003. The construction of the library provided important employment for residents of Quezalguaque who worked alongside Brookline volunteers. The library contains more than 4,000 books and furniture and equipment donated by Sister City and other organizations. It has internet access, and it also has a computer room furnished by furniture and equipment donated by Brookline Rotary. The library is used frequently by elementary and high school pupils, and also a growing number of college students from Quezalguaque and the surrounding area. Since all Nicaraguan students must purchase their own textbooks, its sets of these provide an important lifeline for those students whose parents cannot afford to do so. A mobile library brings books and activities weekly to rural schools, and the library itself is one of the biggest buildings in town, so it's also used for training, for meetings, for social gatherings, and for children and adults. Free art classes are also held there weekly. Sister City recently sent funds to renovate parts of the library and give it a new coat of paint.
Hi, my name is Peter Moyer. I'm a retired emergency physician and a member of the Sister Cities Health Committee. In the 1990s, the Health Committee helped construct the town's health center and its 2 satellite clinics. More recently, we have donated a colposcope, an ultrasound machine, a laboratory machine, an ambulance, asthma equipment. We have traveled to Nicaragua with groups of students. We've led public health students for a 6 weeks practicum. The main areas they've worked on have been chronic renal insufficiency, disease endemic to that area, and teenage pregnancy, also endemic. The students stay with families for their 6 weeks, which is a very good cultural experience for both sides, as well as work with the local medical director and the regional medical school, Unan Leon, working with both students as well as faculty. So we appreciate your funds to date, and we hope you'll continue to fund us for a bunch of very helpful projects.
Hi, I'm Joanna Sullivan, and I first went to Quezalguaque with Peter Moyer and other Masters of Public Health students back in 2017. Having been to Nicaragua before as a nurse, I was familiar with their healthcare system and the fact that sometimes even basic necessities are lacking. The summer that we went together with the sister city was in 2017. We did a project on adolescent sexual and reproductive health, specifically around teenage pregnancy, STIs, STDs, and HIV. We worked closely with professors from Unan Leon, who were always willing to help us with sister city projects. Fortunately, some of their students also joined us and helped us reach people in outlying areas. We haven't gone back to Quezalguaque for some time because of the pandemic, but we hope to continue these trips in the near future. There's a great need to focus on public health issues, contribute our knowledge and resources, and collaborate with the people of Quezalguaque to find viable solutions.
Hi, my name is Richard Segan. I'm a former president of the Brookline Sister City Project. I wanted to say a few words about our Clean Water Initiative. There have been concerns in the Quezalguaque community about water quality, and parts of the community have had no or very limited access to clean water. In some neighborhoods, for example, there was only clean water coming through the pipe distribution system for 2 or less hours per day. Thanks to generous donations from many people like you, support from the Rotary in Brookline, a partnership with the Rotary Club in Nicaragua, a grant from the Rotary Foundation, and grants secured by ACODES, we have not only tested water quality, but since 2017, there have been many improvements made to the water systems. Many people have worked on this, from those on the ground in Quezalguaque and nearby Leon, to experts and volunteers in the United States, including from our board. Thank you all for making this project possible.
Hi, I'm Sarah Johnson, a Sister City board member and the overall coordinator for water improvements in Quezalguaque. Accessible clean water in Quezalguaque has been an important Sister City initiative from 2017 right up to the present. When we did the needs assessment in 2017, we found out that many things weren't working. The chlorination systems weren't working, seals and screens on wells and tanks were missing, electrical service to the pumps was spotty, water quality was not up to standard, and water quantity was insufficient for the population needs. Much of this was due to a lack of training and support for the local water committees who manage the systems and the lack of financial and material resources. It takes a village, as the saying goes. The Water Improvement Coalition that was established at the onset has been critical in order to first diagnose the problems there and then implement improvements. All 7 water systems that we focused on initially have been improved, and 2 of them even have solar panels to cut dependence on electricity and reduce costs. We still have much more work ahead, but it is our hope, with the generosity of people in Brookline, that we can get clean drinking water to everyone in Quezalguaque. Thank you very much.
I'm Carol Pinheiro, and I'm on the Education Committee. Teaching English is important in Nicaragua. Sister City has offered workshops for English teachers in Quezalguaque, provided by board members with experience in this field. They've taught techniques for students to practice English in the classroom that included activities and games. They've also brought visual aids like pictures to hang around the classroom, and materials like notebooks, markers, pens, and pencils for teachers and students. Some years ago, we were able to secure funds to purchase computers so that each high school would have a computer classroom. Students could learn to use the internet and do research. About 5 years ago, a few English teachers from Quezalguaque came to Brookline for a cultural exchange. They visited both elementary and high schools to observe the teachers. They also shared their language and culture with the students. Here's one of the teachers who participated in these activities.
Hello, my name is Marjorie Flores. I am an English teacher. I work at Germán Pomares School in Quezalguaque. I have been in Boston twice. I was invited by the sister city. The sister city had made many donations to our school. For example, we had many English dictionary, had another English dictionary. We had this beautiful data and that, and also we had some computer labs.
Sister City also supports a project that teaches storytelling techniques to librarians. They learn to read aloud and promote literacy skills among elementary school students. Another project we support is scholarships for university students who don't have the means to pay for tuition, books, and travel. We do this in collaboration with FNE International, who vets the students. Here's someone who received a scholarship.
My name is Muriel Rodriguez. I live in Brookline-Quezalguaque. I received a scholarship from Sister City through SNE. That means I had money every month. First year I am studying medicine at UNALEON. I'm grateful for the scholarship. Thank you.
Much has been done in Quezalguaque since 1987, but as you can see, much remains to be done. We're very grateful to our volunteers and supporters over the years, and other organizations who have helped make these projects possible. We hope that you will consider making a donation so that we can continue to collaborate with our sister city, Quezalguaque. Thank you. Brookline High School has also collaborated on projects like welcoming the English teachers from Quezalguaque, sending a group of students to visit Nicaragua, and supporting the water project by fundraising.
All right. We hope you enjoyed the video. And as you can see, there have been many pressing needs in Quezalguaque throughout our 35-year relationship. Without this collaboration, it is likely that these needs might never have been met. So we hope you will help us continue our work in Nicaragua by donating to Sister City tonight. Now I'll turn it over to Judy Parody, board member, to tell you about the raffle prizes.
Judy.
Thank you. Thank you, Carol.
You have to turn on your sound.
I have it on. Thank you. And we have some raffle prizes for those people that will donate $100 or more by midnight tonight. We wish we had raffle prizes for everyone, but whatever you donate will be greatly appreciated. Handicrafts are very important in Nicaragua. They reflect the culture and tradition of the country. And here is a sampling of what we are offering. The first one you see is an original framed painting done in acrylics of a village in Nicaragua. We also have some books available for raffle prizes, and you'll hear more about that tonight from our esteemed author. We'll get a historical context for what we are presently observing at the borders. Also along the top row, we have some clay bowls that are hand decorated using indigenous materials. On the bottom row, we have coffee from Nicaragua, and that is actually from farm to cup. It's premium Nicaraguan coffee available right here in West Roxbury. We have some embroidered aprons, and the next illustration shows a bowl that is made from a single piece of wood, another indigenous material product. And finally, we have an applique and embroidered bag from Nicaragua. So we hope that everyone will contribute, and those of you who are able to contribute $100 or more, good luck for getting a raffle prize this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Judy. And now, sorry, I'm looking for my cheat sheet, my script. Okay, here we go. Now we've come to the part of the evening that everyone has been waiting for. Dr. Aviva Chomsky has generously offered to speak at our celebration tonight. She is professor of history and the coordinator of Latin American, Latino, and Caribbean studies at Salem State University in Massachusetts. She received her BA, MA, and PhD degrees from the University of California at Berkeley. She has been active in Latin American and immigrant rights issues since the 1990s and has spoken and written widely on the topics of labor rights and immigration. Her latest book is Central Americans' Forgotten History: Revolution, Violence, and the Roots of Migration, which has been described as, and I quote, restoring the region's fraught history of repression and resistance to popular consciousness and connecting the United States intervention and influence to the influx of refugees seeking asylum today. Before we turn the Zoom stage over to Professor Chomsky, we ask that all participants remain on mute throughout the lecture. You can write your questions in the chat box to everyone so that they are not repeated. And Professor Chomsky will make an effort to answer as many as possible after the talk. She'll also take a few questions from the audience. So if you have a question, please click the reaction button in the bottom right and use the raise hand feature. And now I give you Dr. Aviva Chomsky.
Thank you so much, Carol. It's really a pleasure to be here, and it's always inspiring for me. I don't travel around the country very much right now because of COVID also, but when I used to travel around the country a lot, and now travel around via Zoom, to see all of the local organizations in different parts of the United States that are working on different forms of activism and trying to bring about social justice and social change. And sometimes it can feel very grim thinking about the state of the world and the future. But when I travel or get together with groups without traveling, it always kind of restores my belief that we really can create a more just world. So thank you for the work that you do. And thank you for inviting me and continuing to inspire me when the world around doesn't look very inspirational in many respects. So the Sister City Project, I'm going to talk a little bit about why I wrote the book and what I wrote the book about, but I also want to try to connect it directly to the work that you're doing, because the Sister City movement itself, and I do write about it in the book a little bit in a chapter that I have on solidarity with Central America. This Sister City concept started as a kind of a people-to-people diplomacy, and in many ways it was a kind of an apolitical idea that people would have cultural exchanges and create these grassroots connections out beyond the sphere of traditional diplomacy. But I feel like it always had a kind of a radical or progressive underpinning to it, in the idea that that creating connections on the ground could transcend some of the power-hungry leaders at the top, who were often trying to lead us to war and to hate each other, and instead to create these grassroots connections on the ground. But it was really, I think, during the 1980s, during the decade of the Central American revolutions, and just to sort of remind you of the context, Nicaragua had a successful revolution in 1979. El Salvador and Guatemala had ongoing revolutionary movements in the 1980s. Central America had always been treated by the United States as its sort of backyard. And I say always, basically since the middle of the 1800s, I would say, is when the United States, of course, the United States was an expansionist country from its very first founding. And if you look at a map of the American Revolution and the 13 colonies, and then what happened in the decades after independence, expansion, displacement of indigenous populations, imperialism was really central to the United States being what it was. But this expansionism extended down into Central America from the 1850s on. And it wasn't necessarily an expansion with the idea of annexation, but it was an expansion with the idea of economic control, political, military, and economic control. In the case of Nicaragua in particular, which I'll emphasize a little bit more tonight, even though the book really focuses on Guatemala, El Salvador, Nicaragua, and Honduras. I leave out Panama, Costa Rica, and Belize. The other Central American countries get kind of short shrift in the book. But in the case of Nicaragua in particular, this included an invasion in 1912, which led to a several decades long military occupation between 1912 and the middle of the 1930s, with only a brief hiatus in the 1920s, 1926 to 1927, but then the United States was back. And the formation of the Nicaraguan National Guard, or Guardia Nacional, and the elevation of Anastasio Somoza and his extended family that then ruled Nicaragua when the United States finally pulled out in 1933, ruled Nicaragua in a corrupt pro-US dictatorship until overthrown by the Sandinista revolution in 1979. In El Salvador and Guatemala, US intervention was less military and more political and economic, but of course the United States was deeply involved in the overthrow of Nicaragua's democratically elected government in 1954, setting in motion many decades of brutal dictatorship in Guatemala as well. And during the and this was connected, connected really from the very beginning, from the 1850s on, to the idea of an economic model for Central America that would turn Central America into the sort of backyard of the United States. The role of Central America was to provide cheap labor and cheap resources for the US Industrial Revolution, and to serve as a market for US goods, especially as the 20th century progressed. And in order to get access to cheap Central American labor and Central American resources, the United States needed to ally with corrupt and brutal dictators, because the populations would never support a model that exploited them and dispossessed them of their resources. So in order to implement that, a high degree of repression, and the United States provided lots of military aid, but in the 1960s and 70s, revolutionary movements emerged in these three countries, El Salvador, Nicaragua, and Guatemala, culminating in the triumph of the Sandinista revolution, which overthrew the US-supported Somoza dictatorship in Nicaragua in 1979, and which also gave tremendous inspiration to the revolutionary movements in El Salvador and Guatemala. In this context, where Nicaragua was under a revolutionary government that the United States immediately vowed to overthrow and began creating a proxy army, the Contra Army, to overturn this revolution. And And in El Salvador, the revolutionary movement, the FMLN, succeeded in controlling about half of the country's territory. The Sister City movement took on a new cast when I'm going to try not to look at the chat while I'm speaking because it's really distracting to me. So I'm not going to pay attention to what goes into the chat just because it's really hard to talk and read and then lose my train of thought. But it's fine if you keep writing, but I'm just telling you that I'm not going to answer until the very end. But I'm happy to discuss all these things at the end. So as the United States is trying to crush these revolutionary movements, the Sister City movement took on a much more politicized cast in that it was challenging US policy and expressing its support for the revolutionary projects of Central America. So I was living in Berkeley, California at the time. We had a sister city in the rebel-held zone of El Salvador. So did Cambridge, Massachusetts, and Brookline, like many other cities around the United States, sought to develop sister city relationships with Nicaragua. Much of the solidarity movement collapsed after 1990, and I'm going to talk about what happened in the 1990s in just a minute, but to stick with the sister city movement is one of the few that has really continued, has not lost strength, and has a kind of an institutional permanence that has led to you guys continuing these projects in Nicaragua still today. The political context is very different, but the idea of people-to-people diplomacy and these grassroots connections, I just think it's really moving to see how this preceded the revolutionary moment in Central America, grew in the context of the revolutionary moment, and has continued past the revolutionary period. So I just wanted to salute and thank you for the work that you do. So the revolutions, now onto the main part of the talk. The revolutions in Nicaragua, El Salvador, and Guatemala had a lot in common. They were really both political and socioeconomic revolutions. That is, and the political and socioeconomic system that had been implemented by, enforced by, supported by the United States was really a kind of a unified system. That is, the economic model couldn't be enforced without political control and a lot of military backup to the political control. And it was a very exploitative and extractivist socioeconomic model that created large numbers of landless peasants and very high degrees of poverty and marginalization for a significant proportion of the population. So the revolutions were political in trying to overthrow corrupt, militarized, repressive governments. And they were also socioeconomic, that is seeking a redistributive development model where the country's resources would actually be used for the good of the people of the country and not for the profits of foreign investors. And these revolutions, successful in Nicaragua, partially successful, I would say, in El Salvador, in that the FMLN was able to implement its revolutionary project in the zones that it controlled, devastatingly failed in Guatemala in terms of the guerrilla forces' lack of capacity to control, to take any territory, and lack of capacity to protect the populations where it was trying to be active, leading to a horrific genocide in Guatemala against primarily the indigenous populations who were accused kind of automatically by association of being supporters of the revolution, whether they were or not. But especially in Nicaragua and El Salvador, I think that the revolutionary successes led to a tremendous sociocultural change and hope and sense that people, poor people, illiterate people, marginalized people, really could create a new world, a new kind of society with their very own hands and their very own lives. And I lived in Nicaragua for a semester in 1988. And this was when so much had happened to derail and destroy the revolution already. And I'm going to talk about that too. But still, I certainly was able to experience in 1988 this tremendous popular mobilization and sense that we are building the country we want for ourselves, and we really can do it. And this sense among some of the planet's poorest and most dispossessed and marginalized people, and this commitment to the revolution was just really inspiring, not only to other Central Americans, but I think around the world. And the degree of solidarity with the Salvadoran revolutionary movement and with the successful revolution in Nicaragua, I think is testament to this feeling like of hope and inspiration that these revolutions brought. Now, the United States, of course, wanted not to allow this redistributive economic development model. And, you know, it was really interesting watching the film and seeing some of the things that the kinds of projects that the Sister City Project is working on. Many of these were precisely the projects of the Sandinista government. That is, this is what a social welfare state does for its citizens. This is what a redistribution meant in Central America. It meant that the government, instead of enriching the few and the foreign corporations, would dedicate the country's resources to things like building libraries, like literacy campaigns, like building health clinics, like building schools, like creating clean water systems. So access to basic health, sanitation, and education was among the prime goals of the revolution, and something that we saw being implemented in Nicaragua in the 1980s. But the revolution immediately came under attack. As I'm sure you all know, most of you, like I, lived through this period. The United States created, funded, armed, and trained the Contra Army. Ronald Reagan called Nicaragua the biggest threat to the United States since I don't know what. We learned that it was closer to the United States than Texas was to Miami, or some bizarre formulation that Reagan used to try to make us strike terror in our hearts that poor, impoverished Nicaragua was somehow a threat to the United States, and we had to do everything we could to crush it. And so the decade, or close to a decade of the Reagan administration, was the decade of extreme violence being used to try to destroy the economic project of the revolution, and also the hope that Nicaragua brought to poor and exploited and marginalized and dispossessed people around the world, that it might be possible to create a different kind of society, a society based on redistribution and social justice and resources used for the good of the people. So in the 1990s, these revolutionary projects came to an end in different ways, and peace treaties were signed in El Salvador in 1992, in Guatemala in 1996. In a way, the big transition in, the first peace treaties were signed at the end of the 1980s. Nicaragua implemented the Esquipulas agreement with its elections in 1990, which the revolutionary government, the Sandinista government, lost. Candidates lost. And so the revolution was essentially voted out of power and left office peacefully in Nicaragua. In all of these cases, the peace treaties made some political guarantees, and all of the countries moved into some form of democratic electoral system away from the dictatorships of the past. But the peace treaties did not address the socioeconomic issues that had really been one of the major causes of the revolution. And there were basically no socioeconomic guarantees for change written into the peace agreements. So the Guatemalan Revolutionary Movement, the UNRNG, became an official political party and has been able to compete in elections. The Salvadoran Revolutionary Movement The FMLN likewise was transformed into a political party, disarmed, and has competed in elections and even won elections at the national level in El Salvador. And many mayoral elections, even the Guatemalan URNG candidates have won mayoral elections in different areas in El Salvador. And of course, the Sandinistas, or what remained of them in the form of Daniel Ortega, was also voted back into power in the 2000s. But in terms of the socioeconomic projects of the revolution and the relationship of the United States to Central America, the peace treaties really opened the floodgates to the restoration of the US economic model there. The neoliberal economic model that was being implemented around the world under the auspices of international financial institutions on the impoverished countries of the world, which were heavily indebted to these same institutions, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank. So structural adjustment imposed, Ron Weiss, could you mute? Thank you. Imposed by the international financial institutions and free trade agreements, the United States with Mexico in 1994, and then with Central America in the 2000s. So what do I mean by the neoliberal economic model? The neoliberal idea is that the government should play no role in trying to redistribute or provide social welfare to the population. Instead, the market should be the solution to everything. And this is implemented basically in 3 areas. One is in requiring government cutbacks. So government spending on social services needs to be drastically cut. Anything that provides services to the population, and this is the second pillar, is privatization. Everything should be in the hands of the market. Of course, when corporations are making decisions about economic development, they have a very different set of goals than does a popular, accountable government. Corporations are accountable to their shareholders, and what they need to do is make profits. And there's not a lot of profit to be made in supplying water to poor people or education to poor people. That's why the revolutions created governments and governmental institutions to do these things. But this was all kind of rolled back and undone. So government cutbacks, privatization, putting things like water distribution, education into private hands. We see this happening in the United States as well. Of course, the 1990s was a global decade of neoliberalism, not only in the third world, but certainly with much more devastating consequences in the third world. And the third pillar is what was called free trade, agreements like NAFTA, 1994, and CAFTA, 2005, although it took several years to be ratified and implemented. They're called free trade, and they seem to follow this ideology of the market above all. But the word free trade is really a misnomer because these are very complex agreements, many pages long. You don't really need that much to orchestrate free trade. All of those pages are basically full of guarantees for investors and corporations. There's very little about freedom except for the word free, or maybe freedom from government oversight for corporations that want to sell or want to invest in third world countries. So they're especially US and other foreign corporations that are benefiting from these agreements, but of course, Central American elites, just as they benefited from the export-oriented economic models prior to the revolutions, are the Central American elites are also benefiting from these so-called free trade agreements. Two of the most important things that these free trade agreements accomplished in Central America was one, forcing open Central American markets to cheap subsidized US agricultural and manufactured goods. So undermining Central American agriculture and industry by prohibiting Central American governments from subsidizing or supporting small farmers, small businesses, So Central America's markets are flooded with US produced goods for the profits of US corporations. And second, protecting the rights of US investors in Central America. Once again, granting rights to corporations means removing rights from government. So governments are not allowed to do things like raise minimum wages, implement environmental regulations. And if a government tries to regulate or control a foreign investor, or to do anything that changes the conditions under which the investment is made or envisioned, like create new environmental protection laws, Central American governments can't do that. And written into the free trade agreements is the ISDS, the Investor State Dispute Settlement Clause, which means that any dispute between a foreign investor and the government will be decided by arbitration in corporate-friendly venues set up by these international financial institutions. So the economies of Central America had the export economies prior to the revolutions had previously been based on coffee and bananas in the 19th century, in the first half of the 20th century, expanded into foreign investment in beef, the beef industry, cattle raising, and in cotton and sugar in the second half of the 20th century, but now is expanded still further into low-wage sectors like the maquiladora sector, the export processing sector, where US manufacturers outsource the labor-intensive components of their production to cheap countries like Central America, where they're not bound by labor regulations, environmental regulations, and then re-export the products back to the United States. So that's why every single one of us, me included, I can almost guarantee, is wearing some article of clothing that says made in Nicaragua, made in Honduras, made in El Salvador, made in Guatemala, by foreign companies, generally controlled, even if the companies may be South Korean or Chinese, controlled by the US brands like the Gap that import them. So the maquiladora sector, a huge boom in mining and energy sectors, the extraction of natural resources from Central America, and a big expansion in the tourism industry, again, almost all in the hands of multinational chains and all-inclusive resorts. And an expansion in new plantation agriculture systems, especially areas, some in like fruits and vegetables, which again, it used to be just the bananas that came from Central America, but look at your snow peas, look at your broccoli, a lot of it is coming from Central America now. But also in some products that you don't see, like palm oil, which has been a huge expansion of plantation agriculture in the rainforest areas, again, dispossessing indigenous people, destroying the environment. Palm oil that's used both invisibly in many manufactured products, from cosmetics to soaps, but even more so in the manufacture of ethanol, as part of our supposed attempt to move away from fossil fuels into what we call biofuels or agrofuels, much of it grown in the third world, to make us look a little greener in this country, so that Massachusetts, for example, requires, I believe it's 12% ethanol when you fill your tank with gasoline. That's probably coming from Central American palm oil plantations. So another really important component of this economic model is migration. So I want to talk about how migration is related to this economic model, how it's intrinsic to the economic relationship between the United States and Central America. And then I also, at the same time, want to talk about a third pillar of this complex that we're in now. So it's neoliberalism, migration, and the third piece of it is climate change. I already gave you one hint of how climate change is playing a role in the neoliberal era and the migration complex by talking about palm oil. But I want to try to put the whole big picture together here. So as the Neoliberalism also brought about a lot of economic changes in the United States. It brought about the deindustrialization and the loss of a lot of manufacturing jobs that are being shipped abroad. But it also created new demands for labor in some new underpaid sectors. So as the United States economy has shifted from a kind of a spherical shape where you have a large middle class in the middle to more of an hourglass where the middle class is squeezed down and a few, lucky few, are squeezed up, demands for different kinds of services have grown. Everything from childcare to elder care, to fast food, to food processing, to Uber and Lyft, the new digital economy, the gig economy, the informalization of labor that has accompanied neoliberalism in services provided both for the very rich and for the struggling middle class and for the growing sector of the poor who still rely heavily on the service economy, has created a demand for low-wage workers outside of the formal labor system. And many of those workers have come from Central America. Many of them are undocumented, which contributes to how they are kept in the informal labor market and kept out of the formal protected labor market where people get things like benefits and minimum wages and the right to organize unions. The destruction of the revolutionary projects, the loss of the hope for radical transformation at home, and the disillusionment that many Central Americans felt as they saw these revolutionary projects crumble and saw many of their leaders find a way to make out okay in the new order, while the peasant rural majorities were being left behind and pushed back down into exploitation. That loss of hope has also been a spur to migration, encouraging many people to say, well, we're not going to be able to do anything here. We just need to leave. Finally, or not finally, there's still a lot more, but I see I only have 10 minutes left, so I'm going to try to fit everything in here. The new economic model in Central America is heavily dependent on remittances that come from abroad. That is, how can a country survive when there's no land for people, when there's no wages for people? How can corrupt governments survive? In large part because so much of the population depends on remittances from abroad. So people come to the United States and they support families and villages back home. How can US corporations pay such low wages in Central America? Partly because the populations are receiving remittances. And there's even been studies that show that US garment and textile factories have deliberately located in areas where a lot of people are migrating because they know that they can pay lower wages there because people have other sources of income coming from migrant remittances. Remittances also have a deleterious effect on economic development in Central America because the people who come to the US to work are making so much more than anyone could ever make in Central America. It really discourages young people from getting educated and getting trained and getting jobs in their country, and encourages people to think, well, the only way I can be successful is to leave. So it really creates a kind of a vicious cycle, even when it also is what is allowing populations to survive. The influx of remittances has also, of course, in the neoliberal era, created new avenues for profit, with companies like Western Union skimming off large amounts of what's made, and banking systems doing the same. New avenues for corruption and new avenues for criminality as large sums of money are moving around. And migration also frees land for economic development. That is, if people leave, if villages die, that means that peasants don't actually have to be displaced with violence. They're already gone and their land is available for foreign investors to do things like build mines, build dams, build energy projects, build plantations. So what about the climate? I want to bring this last piece of the puzzle in because I think it is really an important piece. And it's really in the 1990s when we start feeling, I mean, of course, scientists knew and the general public knew well before the 1990s what was happening with climate change. But it's really in the 1990s when people start feeling the impacts in their daily lives, especially in the third world, especially in areas like Central America that are already vulnerable to things like drought, to flooding, have large coastlines that are in a hurricane region. So all the increase in all of this since the 1990s has been a big spur to migration, especially I would say drought and hurricanes that have pushed people out, and especially because there's no government services or infrastructure to protect or to rebuild after these things. The United States has been able to address or mitigate, I put those in quotes because supposedly a large part of the US efforts to address or mitigate climate change have actually come from outsourcing dirty industries to places like Central America, which make it look like Central America is contributing more and we are contributing less CO2 to the atmosphere, when really US companies are just moving their production abroad and still bringing their products back to sell here. And the same thing that I mentioned earlier with palm oil. Now, when migrants come to the United States, they're immediately, like it or not, forced into a much higher consumption lifestyle because it's impossible to live here without consuming manufactured goods and having a car and contributing in our daily lives more to climate change than do poor people in the third world. Of course, migrants also send remittances home that help their families raise their consumption levels, and much of it is also spent on things like buying cars and building big houses in Central America, further contributing to climate change. And then two more pieces of the puzzle, and then I will finish. One is that if you listen to the Biden administration's plans for Central America, Biden came into office with a plan for security and prosperity in Central America. Now, he's not the first US president who has offered prosperity to Central America, and the recipe for prosperity is always the same from 1850 to the present. It's more foreign investment in the export economy. So that's exactly what Joe Biden is proposing for Central America, for prosperity in Central America. And of course, more investment in the export economy is simply going to create greater deforestation, greater industrial production, and greater contribution to climate change. And finally, US domestic policies have consistently promoted the idea that there is an American standard of living, which is a high consumption economic model that is completely based on fossil fuels. So US policies towards Central America are exacerbating climate change, and US domestic policies are exacerbating climate change. And the more we warm the climate, the more people are going to be forced out of their homes in Central America, and the less possible it's going to be for Central America to really successfully create a different model of economic development as seemed possible in the 1980s, and as many Central Americans are still struggling for today. So I will end there, and someone's going to moderate the questions in the chat for me, right? But if you have, if you want to raise your hand, I will answer you. But if you want to post in the chat, is Carol, are you going to be the one to moderate, or Kathleen? Can't hear you, Carol.
I'm the one that's moderating. I'm going to read the questions that are coming into the chat. Okay. And the first one is, if you had the power to prohibit all business relationships between Nicaragua and the United States, how would that solve all the problems you identify?
It wouldn't. The current form of business relationships is generally very harmful to the poor of Nicaragua. But the United States is not the only country investing in Nicaragua, and not all investment is necessarily harmful to the poor. It depends what kind of investment it is and what kinds of projects it's promoting. I mean, I would say your Sister City project is investing in education and sanitation, and those are obviously projects that are in the interests of the population of Quezalguaque. Now, many of the investment projects have been in the interests of some sectors of Central America's population. And that's why Central American governments and Central American elites have supported this model. It's not just something that the United States is imposing on all of Central America. It's something that the United States is pursuing in alliance with certain sectors of Central American society. So I would say it's not necessarily exactly investment per se, but it's what are the conditions and goals and nature of that investment.
The question before that you've partially answered. Do our efforts continue to make sense as Daniel restores a dictatorship in Nicaragua?
I think that the Sister City project plays a very different role now than it did in the 1980s. At least in some ways, a very different role now than it did in the 1980s. I mean, I wasn't here when you started the Sister City project, but I've been involved in a lot of other Sister City projects. And I suspect that the reason that Brookline started it in 1985 was out of a sense of wanting to support the Sandinista revolutionary project. And that the Sister City projects that started in the 1980s generally worked with the Sandinista government and were a form of opposition to US policy, a form of protest against US policy that was trying to destroy the Nicaraguan revolution. The context today is quite different. But the people of Quezalguaque desperately need the kinds of projects. Now, the government of Nicaragua should be providing, like in an ideal world, the government should be building libraries and schools and health centers and clean water systems, right? But they're not. So does your project make sense? Your project is not going to bring about a revolution in Nicaragua. If your goal is to bring about a revolution, then this is not the project to do it. But if your goal is to help the people of Quezalguaque, then yes, this project makes a lot of sense. And it's almost their only lifeline when their government is not doing those things.
Thank you. Can you comment on the gangs in Honduras and their history? Is there a solution to this problem?
Yes. And I have a whole section on gangs in the book. So one thing I will say about the gangs, not just in Honduras, but also in Guatemala and El Salvador, is that there's a big difference in Nicaragua from the rest of Central America in terms of the nature and prevalence and meanings of gang activity in Nicaragua versus in those other three countries, Nicaragua, El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. So the gangs have both domestic and transnational roots. There have been youth street gangs in urban areas since well before large-scale migration to the United States started. But they were small-scale gangs. They were almost closer to kind of mutual support groups. A lot of children who had been kicked out of their homes or didn't have homes to go home to who created these sort of street life and street society. And Deborah Levinson, who just retired from Boston College, has written a really interesting study of the evolution of gangs in Guatemala called Adios Niño. And looks at how the horrific violence and destruction of the 1980s and the destruction of the social fabric really radicalized the gangs in the sense of not political radicalism, but in the sense of violence and hopelessness and basically young children whose only thought was to kill or to die. And that really came from the genocide that they lived to and the destruction of the hope and social fabric of their communities and the hopes that were raised in the 1980s for a kind of a positive social transformation. And so there's something of that going on in El Salvador and Honduras as well. That is the flood of arms into the country, the excessive violence carried out by the paramilitary death squads and the militaries, many of them trained by the United States, created a kind of trauma that doesn't disappear in one generation. And much of this has turned into a kind of an intergenerational trauma now. You know, it was children who saw their siblings murdered by the military, and then it's the children of those children. Another factor, I guess I'll go into two more factors. One more factor contributing to the gangs is the experience of especially Salvadoran youth in Los Angeles, where during the 1980s, as many fled the wars, Los Angeles and especially Los Angeles, also San Francisco, and then spreading into other parts of California and the country, became a real center for Salvadoran refugees. And the Los Angeles school system had its own, and again, these were kind of low scale, not the kind of violence that we see going on in the gangs in Central America today, but youth gangs and cliques in the school and Salvadoran students to defend themselves against Mexican-American and African-American gangs started forming their own gangs. Many of them were then deported back to El Salvador and criminalized in the United States and in El Salvador, criminalized and completely denied any opportunity to go to school, to get housing, to work, to reestablish family ties. And so the actual gangs that we hear about in El Salvador, the two main gangs, the Mara Salvatrucha and Calle 18, both actually had their origins in Los Angeles. So the criminal justice system, the war on drugs in the United States, and the war on immigrants in the United States has also played a role in the growth and the violence of Central American youth gangs. And the final piece of the puzzle that I want, well, two more pieces of the puzzle that I should talk about. One is the war on drugs. In a way, the war on drugs replaced the counter-revolution in terms of being a pretext for the United States to pour military resources into corrupt and violent Central American governments and private security forces. So everywhere that the US drug war went, violence exploded. And the drug wars themselves, drug trafficking and the drug wars, which have only served to increase, not to decrease drug trafficking. The only effect that they've had on decreasing has been what's called a kind of balloon effect, where drug cultivation might be pushed out of one area through fumigation and pushed into another area. But the entire US drug war had the long-term effect of making drug trafficking much more dangerous, much more violent, and much more profitable. And the more money that has grown into it, the more the drug trafficking has been linked with high sectors of the government, with local elites in these areas, and with economic development projects. So, and with private security forces. So the militarization of the drug traffic has really contributed to the growing violence and dangerousness of the gangs as well. And many youth have been forcibly, you know, in the 1980s, they may have been forcibly recruited into the army. Now they're forcibly recruited into the large transnational drug gangs as low-level workers, basically, but with little choice and a lot of violence. So Nicaragua has, to a large extent, been immune from much of what has happened to the gangs since the 1980s. There are gangs in Nicaragua, but they look more like the high school gangs in the 1980s in Los Angeles, or the street gangs that Deborah Levinson wrote about in Guatemala in the 1980s. They're nothing like the excessively violent and horrific and corrupt and transnational gangs that exist in El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala.
Thank you. Can you speak about the current regime in Nicaragua of Ortega and Murillo?
A little bit. A friend of mine just read the book and he said, you know, your chapter on Nicaragua looked like you were weighing every word so carefully. And I said, yeah, I was weighing every word so carefully in my chapter on Nicaragua. So, you know, in the elections in 1984, the elections in 1990, the Sandinistas, you know, the analysis of the change made looked like there's about 30 to 40% of the population that is hardcore support for the Sandinistas during the revolution. There's another 30% that was hardcore opposition to the Sandinista revolution. And then there was the middle that swung between 1984, when they voted for the revolution, and 1990, when they voted against the revolution for the US-backed candidate, Violeta Chamorro. Daniel Ortega still retains the support of that hardcore 30 to 40% of Nicaragua's population. And despite what we've seen in terms of electoral corruption and jailing of opposition candidates, it seems pretty clear that Daniel won the election, the recent elections, because he had enough support, enough votes to win them, and that he probably would win the election even without all of the repression that he has been implementing against the opposition. In the 1980s, it was really clear that the United States was the major factor meddling in Nicaragua's elections. The United States paid off candidates, created parties, brought people together, and funded opposition, and probably most important of all, made it very clear to the Nicaraguan people that if the Sandinistas won the election in 1990, the war would continue. And if the opposition won, the war would end. Almost all Nicaraguans wanted the war to end. They wanted the United States to stop attacking their country. And the, you know, when we talk about interference in elections, that, I mean, if we were told that if a certain candidate won the election, Russia or China was going to start bombing us every day and destroying our infrastructure and killing our children, you know, a lot of us would be pretty worried about that, especially if they were already doing it, as was happening in Nicaragua. So I think it's almost difficult for us to comprehend what it means to be living under attack from the most powerful country, direct military attack from the most powerful country in the world. and being told that the only way to stop that is to vote for the candidate that they want. The United States has continued to try to promote opposition in Nicaragua. It's not even really clear to me why the United States opposes Daniel Ortega now, because he is not implementing a revolutionary program in Nicaragua anymore. It's also not really clear to me why the United States can't simply accept the Cuban government now. You know, back in the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, I think the Cuban government and the Nicaraguan government represented a threat, not to US security or well-being, but to the US economic model that the United States wanted for those countries. That doesn't justify the US intervention, but it makes me understand why the evil government of the United States would want to intervene in these countries. Now I don't even understand why the United States is so intent on forming and funding opposition in these countries. But I do think that in both cases, in Nicaragua and Cuba, when the governments, the fact of US continued intervention justifies, at least in their own eyes, not necessarily in my eyes, but in their own eyes, justifies Miguel Díaz-Canel in Cuba or Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua saying, well, there's no opposition, it's just all created by the United States. Now, I don't think that's true, but I can understand why they think that, given what the United States is doing in their countries. If the United States really wanted more democracy in Nicaragua or more democracy in Cuba, I think it would allow those countries to, and the people of those countries, to fight for democracy, the democracy they want in their own way, and stop trying to manipulate it.
Staying on that same topic for a moment, can you comment, considering the current situation in Nicaragua, why there's repression of local civil society organizations and the governor revoking the registration of international and multilateral organizations?
I think that grows directly out of what I was just describing. That is, I mean, I think the United States is deliberately provoking that by, and that doesn't mean that I justify the Nicaraguan government responding that way, but I think that it's precisely the goal of the United States in interfering, funding, mobilizing, manipulating an opposition in Nicaragua and in Cuba, in part to provoke those governments into responding with repression. That doesn't mean that the governments should respond with repression. I wish they wouldn't, but I think the United States is achieving its goals, that those are precisely the goals of the National Endowment for Democracy, US Agency for International Development, the huge funding that the United States is pouring into trying to promote an opposition in those countries. And I think it would be to the benefit of everyone if the United States would grant Nicaraguans and Cubans the right to form or not form their own oppositions and develop them without the interference of the United States.
Thank you. How do you explain the difference between the drug trafficking in Nicaragua versus what appears to be far more in Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras?
In many ways, I attribute it to the decade of revolution in Nicaragua in comparison to the decade, I'm looking at the 1980s, the decade of repression in Guatemala and El Salvador, which laid the groundwork for this intensive militarization of society, growth of paramilitary forces, legitimization of paramilitary and military official violence, the destruction of a generation of youth, and the ways that the destruction of the social fabric during those decades, which despite the Contra War, despite the electoral loss of the Sandinistas in 1990, did not happen at all in the same way in Nicaragua So, I think that both Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador were just fertile ground for the explosion of drug trafficking in a way that Nicaragua was not, because of the successes of the Nicaraguan Revolution.
Okay. And the last question that I have at this moment in the chat is, please speak about Ortega and Murillo now in 2021. Things have really greatly changed. Ortega has been engaged in a lot of repression, violence, squashed opposition, jailed hundreds, killed people, etc.
I mean, I think that's kind of the same question that I've already answered a couple of times, but
Yes.
we'll say that after 1990, the Sandinista party split between the Orthodox wing, which was Ortega's wing, and the renovation wing, the MRS, Movimiento de Renovación Sandinista, which many US supporters of the revolution were much more sympathetic to the MRS. The MRS had more English speakers, more highly educated Sandinistas, more people who had worked much more closely with US supporters of the revolution. But the problem was that the MRS never gained a base of popular support in Nicaragua. To most poor Nicaraguans, Daniel Ortega and the Orthodox Sandinistas still represented the Nicaraguan Revolution. And the MRS itself has split and reformulated a number of times, but it's never gained a base of popular support in Nicaragua, even though internationally, those are some of the figures who continue to be the most admired, and to many international supporters seem to represent what was best about the Nicaraguan Revolution, rather than Ortega, who, as you say, has been associated with all of these violations, and yet continues to maintain that core of Sandinista support. So that's what I can say about it, I guess.
Thank you. One more came in just at this moment. If MRS never gained support, why did they have to be repressed by Ortega along with other opposition?
As I said, I don't think that there's any opposition force that actually poses an electoral threat to Daniel Ortega. Is he paranoid about US meddling? Yes. Does he have reason to be paranoid about US meddling? Yes. Do I think he should be jailing? Me personally think he should be jailing the opposition? Of course not. Do I even think it's in his own interest to jail the opposition? I don't think so. But I don't have his ear, so I can only try to analyze what he's doing. I'm not trying to defend it.
Thank you.
And I'm certainly not, he doesn't listen to me. I've never talked to him.
One final question here. What tools can we develop to help people of Nicaragua against the dictatorship?
Again, I don't really think that's our job to decide what kind of politics Nicaragua should have and what the Nicaraguan people should be doing. I think the kind of work that you are doing in the sister city is responding to popular movements in Nicaragua and to movements to improve the life of ordinary Nicaraguans. I think that's really important work, but I don't really think it's our job to develop or support an opposition to, whether we like it or not, what is the elected government of Nicaragua. I just don't think that's our place. And given the history of US intervention in Nicaragua, all the more reason why we should not think it's our job to decide what kind of government Nicaragua should have.
I think that question was asked by a Nicaraguan. So maybe wondering what they can do to fend off Ortega or the dictatorship.
I guess I would just have to reiterate that I don't think it's my job to tell Nicaraguans what they should do to change their government. the more people from the United States try to tell them what they should do, the less legitimacy that they're going to have at home.
It says, what is the position from the Solidarity Program with the actually social situation in Nicaragua? Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm
You're talking about the Solidarity Center, the AFL-CIO Solidarity Center, or what exactly do you mean by the Solidarity Program?
If the person who asked that question could kindly clarify. Yes, he says yes. Whatever you said, he says yes.
The Solidarity Center is what you're referring to?
I mean, I am thinking about what is the, because during the last 35 years, a lot of people from the United States development program to solidarity in Nicaragua, like the sister city or something like that. But right now they definitely can't do anymore. What is the position, or can be the position for the new, thinking about new situation? So you are thinking about finish this solidarity, because definitely we will to need it in the next times.
Well, I mean, I think this organization is an example of how solidarity is continuing under very different political conditions and with a different relationship with the Nicaraguan government, a different immediate goals, different place in the larger picture of what's going on in Nicaragua, and yet continuing to evolve to work in the new current situation in Nicaragua and give solidarity to the Nicaraguan people.
And that was our
organization. Your organization is not the only one. That is, there are many organizations, whether they're sister cities or other kinds of solidarity organizations around the United States, that continue to want to support the Nicaraguan people.
Thank you. That was our final question. Thank you very much.
Are there any other questions from the audience? I think you all did a great job putting your questions in the chat box.
Yeah, you did. And thank you so much for moderating them. That's always a challenge when I'm trying to speak.
My pleasure.
All right. Well, I guess we will bring this to a conclusion. Thank you very much, Dr. Chomsky. The research and insights you've shared with us are very thought-provoking and will make us think more deeply when we read articles about Central America and hear about the migrants who are leaving their countries and seeking asylum in the US. We'll know more about the responsibility of those who created the structures and the economic and the political barriers in the past that have caused this phenomenon to occur today. And hopefully we'll be moved to lobby Congress for changes in legislation, to join organizations that assist migrants, or to contribute in some way to alleviate their plight. So our profound appreciation to Professor Chomsky for tonight. And we wish all of you a good evening. And if anybody would like to stay around and chat or discuss later, we don't want to keep Professor Chomsky too long after this. I would just like to say thank you for the members from Sister City, for the celebration committee, the fundraising committee, for your help tonight and before tonight. And thank you to all the members of Sister City who, continue to contribute and to travel and to engage with our brothers and sisters in Quezalguaque.
Thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you for organizing this, and thank you all for coming and for your wonderful questions.
Thank you.
Are we open for comment yet?
Yes, we don't want to keep Dr. Chomsky anymore, but if she would like to stay around for the discussion.
She has a leave button. She can leave.
What would you like to say, Arch?
I'd like to say at the end of all this discussion and you know, the thing of, you know, what do we do when our revolution is turned into a dictatorship and et cetera. I'd like to point out that Quezalguaque is a small city in Nicaragua. They are our sister city, not the whole nation of Nicaragua. And I think what we continue to do what we can for our brothers and sisters in Quezalguaque, and we take care not to cross the government in such a way as we get thrown out, because we've come close to that on occasions in the past. And Professor, some of us here on this side of the screen have in fact sat and talked with Daniel Ortega in the past. And I remember telling my granddaughter, who spent a few months in Ometepe last summer, that if she got in trouble, I could still call Daniel, but I didn't want to. So not to mention that to anyone, unless she was in real trouble. But some of us do go back. Now, I don't go back certainly as far as Maxine, but I always remember the day we were returning home from working on the library, when we were stopped in the parquet by a group of people who demanded to know whether the library we were building was going to be a Sandinista library or for everybody. And we invited them on the spot to join the board of the library. So Quezalguaque is a very Sandinista town. I understand it still is, but Sister City was never a Sandinista organization.
And in a way, I think that's one of the reasons why Sister City has been able to maintain the longevity that it has, while other solidarity organizations have kind of faded. That commitment to that sort of grassroots people to people long-term connection.
I have to say, frankly, that we sometimes do, we do a project and then we see it on television or one of their video channels, and we see the government taking credit for the projects we do. But that's, I think, part of the package of working there.
I would suggest we not overlook the number of times the government, in fact, very usefully partnered for us. I mean, their housing program was much more successful than Habitat for Humanity's project and a number of other things. It has not been a one-way street.
I mean, the other thing I think that the real strength of the Sister City approach is that so many NGOs and development organizations kind of parachute in, make a diagnosis, and then pour a little money into their project and then leave. And that's a really, really ineffective method of economic development. And I think that the longevity of your project is one of its real strengths.
One of the stories I love is the fact that it took us a long time to get all the comarcas to send their representatives to one meeting to sit and talk about what they wanted us to do and have the gringos stop bringing ideas and projects and selling them to them. And it was very important. And the upside of it was they decided to do the one thing we said we would not do. There was a small comarca who was teaching their kids in somebody's living room, and they wanted a school. All they wanted was a 2-classroom schoolhouse. And we had always said we were not going to build schools for the government. But we asked them to come, we asked them to vote, and by God, we built the school. And I'll shut up now. I've talked enough.
Yeah. Since Aviva is still here, I did want to ask one more question about the theme of the, that we were speaking about. And I got the impression from your presentation that you consider the unrest in Nicaragua to be nurtured and pushed and maybe even started by the US government? I didn't understand really how much you felt the US government was responsible for it, because I think a lot of it was indigenous. Just having spent time there recently, in fact, a month before the original protests, having spoken to people from Nicaragua, but even when I was there before the protest started in 2018, there was a lot of dissatisfaction in Nicaragua. And there's been a lot of suppression of any kind of political protest around the canal, if you remember, the takings of the land for the canal. So I felt that you were giving more weight to outside influences than the dissatisfaction of the Nicaraguan people, and also their response to a overly powerful response of the government to simple protests around the original Social Security issue and the student participation. And I think their response to that just blew up all the frustration that had been existing in Nicaragua through maybe the other 70% of the people or the other 60% of the people. So I'm trying to understand your point of view about the American influence of what's happening, of the protest.
So I don't think what you attributed to me is exactly what I said.
That's why I wanted to understand it better.
I was talking about US policy, and I was critiquing US policy. And I did not say that I thought US policy was responsible for the protests in Nicaragua. But as a US citizen who wants to have an influence on what my government does, I do not think that the US policy of trying to promote opposition in Nicaragua, giving money to opposition organizations, giving training to opposition leaders and organizations, I do not think those are constructive policies for my government to follow, and I don't want them to follow those policies. I think that that those policies simply add fuel to the Nicaraguan government's claim that that all opposition is fomented by the United States. And if the United States really wanted to allow Nicaraguans to determine their own future, the best way to do that would be to stop doing what they're doing.
And what are they doing, though? Can you
what I just said? They're funding, they're training, they're cultivating, they're bringing people to the United States for training, they're sending US advisors to work with organizations, and they just shouldn't be doing that. It's not their job. Yeah. It makes things worse. Nicaraguan opposition should be allowed to develop on its own without US manipulation and influence.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to change the subject, because that's important, but I want this one to go back to something that you said and something that Arch said about the difference between our organization and other solidarity organizations or other organizations that are operating now. And I remember years ago when the first time that Hugo was mayor, and he said, "You guys are our favorite international organization." I said, "Yeah, sure, you say that to everybody." He said, "No, I'll tell you why." He said, "The other people come, they stay in a hotel in Leon and they go back. You guys come, you stay in our homes, you become part of our community." That's all.
I noticed that Shaman has his proverbial hand up. There's an empty space, sir, if you want to speak.
Thank you very much. I apologize. I don't have my webcam activated right now with my phone. I just have my microphone. So I just would like to share a little bit of my perspective. I am Nicaraguan. I'm a student from Nicaragua since I started this new revolution, I will say, in 2018 with my friends back in Managua. So this is what's going on, like pretty much just to put you in a little bit of a like inside perspective of what's going on right now in Nicaragua. Since we, the young people, has been like trying to change the paradigm of the revolution of Nicaragua. Unfortunately, Nicaragua has been going in a cycle of violence every 40 years approximately. This cycle has been perpetuated pretty much since the Spanish came to conquer, technically, to Nicaragua and devastate our society as the way we used to know it. Since that actually happened, new, I would say, messiahs, or like people who believe they are the saviors of the Nicaraguan people, put in power, and they, by the guns, they command the country and control the resources. So we believe, I mean, when I say we believe, we, the young people, believe life has changed a lot with technology, with a lot of knowledge and seeing life from different perspectives. So that's why we created this another revolution, but we did this time with no guns. We tried to do this new revolution with no guns because we want to break the paradigm of violence. We believe violence, it's a matter of miscommunication. At the end, two persons who thinks different should agree in a middle point. I understand you are thinking different than I am, but this is not a reason for me to be violent to you and obligate you or persuade you in an aggressive way to think the way I am. Therefore, we create this new revolution in a civil way, which we have been trying as much as we can to change the paradigm of violence in Nicaragua. Since we started doing this in 2018, unfortunately, the government, in this case, Daniel Ortega, did not saw the perspective we saw. Daniel Ortega is involved in his mind. This is a revolution from the American people, or America. It's financing all these organizations for creating this revolution. I was part of the, I would say, privileged group who starts this revolution, and I deep understand the situation, and I deep know the people who was against me and besides me working to change Nicaragua. So this is not a finances, this is not a revolution financed by the American people. This is a revolution financed by ideas of young people who want to change and want to create a different perspective, not only for Nicaragua, but actually show the world people like us, young people with technology, with a little bit of more conscience and awareness about how to create harmonious environment, taking care of nature and other human beings, can change the world, not only our country. Unfortunately, Daniel Ortega is a person who has been raised his life in violence, and he don't understand this different perspective, and he only fights with violence against us, like finances these little gangs, you know. When the professor was talking about gangs in Nicaragua who are like very little, technically there is no gangs in Nicaragua. The only gang in power is called FSLN, which is the political party of the Nicaraguan government. He actually liberated a lot of prisoners from the jails to convert these prisoners into police to be part of the regime. So technically police, military, and even gangs are from the political party. So everything is just one organization. I don't want to extend too much into this topic, but I would like to share with you guys. That's why I asked what kind of tools we can all together create to help the people of Nicaragua, because we are trying our best to don't get violence. We don't want to reach the point, okay, there's no other point, just grab the guns and take this guy out by the guns. We're gonna create against another people, put it on power by the guns, and we want to break the circle. So it's very important, as much as you guys know, put sanctions, you know, like as we put sanctions for the vice presidents, for the mayor of the police, from the mayor of the militaries, and so on and on. But it's not only about sanctions, but also like develop different tools for communication to actually agree with people who think different than us, because we do understand it's not about eliminate the opposition. It's not about killing the other person who people who think different than us, but to create a point in the middle so two sides can agree. Because Sandinistas, even the people who are, like, let's say, a little bit more educated, who understand the path of communication and harmony, try to change, but the Sandinistas who still living in Nicaragua, and we cannot go against our own brothers and sisters. But we can create a dialogue so we can all live together in harmony without any intervention, but actually creating tools for communications and awareness. Thank you very much for your time. It has been a beautiful speaking for you, Professor, and I appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Shaman, could I ask you one question? You still there?
Yes.
What part of Nicaragua are you from, Shaman?
I am from the city, from Managua.
From Managua, okay. Very good. I appreciated everything you had to say, and I'm sure that you agree that some of it is well beyond our intended purpose. It will never be the purpose, in my opinion, of Sister City to coordinate the overthrow and replacement of the government of Nicaragua, regardless of what it is. But I do appreciate your sentiments. They are very well crafted. Thank you.
You're very welcome. And thank you all you guys to give a little bit of this spark to our minds to create a more harmonious society, not only for Nicaragua, but could actually help to be an example for the rest of the world.
Sora?
Yeah. Hi, Avi.
Hi, Sora. Nice to see you.
Same here. I'm going back to what Fran's point and what you brought up. Towards the end, you said that, you know, the U.S. is funding and training and bringing people here. So, I mean, we know that the opposition, there is no one opposition at this point in Nicaragua. Is the U.S. funding and training and supporting everybody from the left all the way to the right, or are there particular sectors that they're supporting? Do you know?
No, I don't know. And I'm not sure anybody knows, because a lot of this is done through private contractors that receive grants from USAID and are not very transparent about the work that they're doing. So, like, we know how much money Congress authorizes, but there's a lot of underground stuff that we don't know about, and we don't actually, it's not that easy to get information about where all the money that Congress authorizes goes. So, you know, with regard to Cuba, there's a Tracy Eaton, a journalism professor in Florida, who has basically dedicated his life towards tracking down every USAID project in Cuba and who it's going to. I don't believe anybody has devoted themselves to that research in Nicaragua. If they have, I'm not aware of it.
I can help you a little bit answer that question, because when the 2018 starts and different organizations get together to go against the dictator, there was an organization was called UNAP, which was the unification of different sectors, like in terms of private sectors, farmers, students, LGBT, and so on and so forth. So the American people turned to Congress and other organizations like USAID was helping financing this organization particularly to help and create like a kind of opposition to their dictatorship. But unfortunately, the dictator gets like very, very, very repressive and start putting all these presidential people in jail and taking away from Nicaragua all these organizations for human rights who could use to send money. So USAID is already kicked out, and 50 something else organizations for human rights, for democracy, for helping farmers and other things you can use it to manage money now are blocked, kicked out of the country. And also he changed the law to regulate any transaction over, I think it's $500 in terms of Western Union money, grant or whatever who's going to the country, so he can regulate it and know how much money is getting into the country so he can bust it in any way. Maybe I align you a little bit with this answer. Human rights who could use to send money. So USAID is already kicked out, and 50 something else organizations for human rights, for democracy, for helping farmers and other things you can use it to manage money now are blocked, kicked out of the country. And also he changed the law to regulate any transaction over, I think it's $500 in terms of Western Union money, grant or whatever who's going to the country, so he can regulate it and know how much money is getting into the country so he can bust it in any way. Maybe I align you a little bit with this answer.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments?
I think maybe I'm going to sign off because I have a big day tomorrow.
Well, we appreciate you very much coming. I know you had a teaching day today and you said, I can make it at 7, but not earlier. So thank you very much.
An intense part of the semester up here in Salem. So, but thank you all very much. It's really great to hear all your perspectives and hear about the work you're doing. So thanks.
All right, thank you. And many of us are reading your book, so we'll keep in touch.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.